Hello and welcome to another video where today I'll be sharing my 5 tips to help you pass your internal accounting systems and controls exam. This exam did get off to a bit of a rocky start, but does seem to have stabilised now, which means it's a far more suitable time to share some tips for getting through it. Tip number 1 then, and it's always best to start with the basics, and that is exam format. So the INAC exam consists of 5 tasks, which in total come to 100 marks. So nice and easy, we know you need 70% to pass, and therefore 70 marks are required out of the 100 on offer. It isn't an even split of marks in the exam, and I've included the breakdown of marks for each task on screen now. You'll have 2.5 hours to complete this exam, and from feedback we've received, it does seem to be enough time without causing any major problems. Tip number 2, knowing what to expect on each question. So knowing what to roughly expect on each question does often alleviate some nerves when going into the exam, because it reduces, not eliminates, but reduces that element of surprise. So let's look at each question, the topic, and what I'd expect you to see come up. Task 1 then. The topics for this question are the roles and responsibilities of the accounting function within an organisation and understanding of the impact of technology on accounting systems. It's a multiple choice question. There'll be a range of questions with different scenarios posed with options. There'll be a combination of multiple choice questions and drop-down style questions. You should really be nailing this question. It's been well answered so far, and with it being worth 25 marks, it's literally a quarter of the exam straight off the bat. So as long as you've been doing well within the mocks, I don't see you having any problems in the real thing either. Task 2 is on evaluating internal control systems, specifically in the context of preventing and detecting fraud and systematic weaknesses. It will also cover evaluating an organisation's accounting system and their underpinning procedures, specifically in respect of fraud. So this will be your first written task. It has so far been the most problematic question within this exam, which is why I'll be dedicating a more detailed look at this question further on. But for now, all you need to know is that it will basically be a written question where you need to evaluate a business's procedures. Task 3 then will test you on your ability to evaluate the use of internal control systems. This is another multiple choice and drop-down question where you'll be given short scenarios and have to determine whether suitable controls have been put in place to mitigate that risk. Generally speaking, this task has been well answered. So again, it's not one I would be overly concerned with and should be relatively straightforward after going through a few mock exams. Task 4 is concerned with the effectiveness of a specific accounting system of an organisation. The details of the accounting system are given and you're required to identify the weaknesses in that system, analyse the cause of those weaknesses and evaluate the impact of those weaknesses. So it's kind of similar to task 2, but this time without the focus on fraud. Now my biggest tip for this task is to please make sure you're assessing the information and using the scenario to identify the weaknesses that are apparent in the scenario. I'm seeing it quite often where students making their own assumptions or actually even bordering on creating their own scenarios to answer a question that they'd prefer to answer than answering the question in front of them. Please also make sure you're hammering home the impact of that weakness to the business in your answers. And remember to assume the examiner knows nothing, so spell it out for them and you'll have no problem picking up the majority of marks for this task. Task 5 then, the last task, will have you recommending improvements to the organisation's accounting system. This includes the effects of changes on the users of the systems. Now this is another written task and can take the form of such as a SWOT analysis, a PESEL analysis, or a cost-benefit analysis. Within the task, it's very important to be able to identify both financial and non-financial factors, and just as importantly, be able to provide recommendations for your points. Tip number 3 is a focus on task 2, which has received the weakest performance out of all the tasks within the exam. Now, I've already spoken briefly about this task, and you should now know, if you didn't already, that this task centres around fraud. So for this task, you're going to have to identify risks within an organisation. The key part is not finding any risk to the organisation, but finding risks that could potentially create a fraudulent risk. So the task as a whole is related to fraud. However, it may only mention this at the top of the task, and therefore students have, in the past, forgotten this when answering the written part of the question, because it's not being specifically repeated further down in the question. The next part where I've seen marks lost is not making enough points for the marks available. Every point made is a potential mark, but I've found that many students are only putting 1 point for a 2-mark question, so straight away you're limiting your marks available to half. One last point on this is that I would highly recommend reading up on the risk matrix, which looks at 2 different perspectives, which are the likelihood of the risk occurring and the impact of that risk. I've included an example of the risk matrix on screen now for reference. You need to be able to identify in the assessment the level of a specific risk to a business. It's not something that will definitely come up, however, if it does, you need to be aware of how to answer it, and if you've never seen one before, that really does damage your chances. Tip number 4 is to make sure you're comfortable with the advice given in the examiner's report. So this is something I would highly recommend looking through in full and can be found in the Lifelong Learning portal under this unit, right at the bottom underneath the mock exams. Now I've picked out my key points here that I think are the most important to take into account. With me specifically going through task 2 in my previous tip, I've focused on task 4 and 5 here, which are the task students that struggle with the most after task 2. So the first point is on task 4 and is something that I've noticed marking mock exams, which is including more than one weakness in a point, but not explaining the impact or cause of that weakness. I think that occurs particularly when you're scrambling for ideas and you're just trying to get anything you've ever known about accounting down into the answer box, rather than just structuring your answers properly. Remember, make your point, explain what it means, and follow it up with the impact it will have on the business. Then, if necessary, a possible resolution, although you will only have to do this on certain questions. The next point is on task 5, which is not understanding the difference between a weakness and a threat. So this occurs on being asked to perform a SWOT analysis and has historically always been a problem because it can be quite tricky and they are easily confused. So remember, a weakness is an internal factor that would hinder or slow progress within a business. So examples could be poor management, limited resources, outdated technology, or operational inefficiencies. Now, a threat is an external factor which could harm the business. Threats could come from competitors, changing market conditions, regulatory changes, national recessions, or changing technologies. So we can clearly see that the difference is whether the issue is come from an external perspective, i.e. a weakness, or external influence, i.e. a threat. My final tip, tip 5, is to use correct revision techniques. Throughout the other level 4 exams, although you'll have had written questions, the majority of your marks have come down to calculation-based questions. However, in this exam, there are no major calculations and certainly no double entry. It's now going to be down to learning, understanding, retaining, applying, and articulating what you've learned throughout the unit. And because of that, it may be that you need to look at revising slightly differently to what you've done before. I would look to use flashcards for key terms. When answering multiple choice questions, I would write down next to the points that are incorrect why they're incorrect. I would also practice writing written answers out in full and actually using your study material to help you supplement your answers initially to make sure you're hitting all the points you can before checking the answer. When reviewing your written answers, try to identify the driver for why you're losing marks. Is it that you're not covering enough points? Is it that you're not explaining your point in detail? Is it that you're not including the impact on the business or person? It also could be that you're not including key areas that it gives you within the question. And that about wraps up this video. This can be a tricky exam, however, given proper preparation, it's definitely feasible to pass with no major issues. Hope you found this video useful, and remember, if you have, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more AAT content. Thanks again for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.